Thanks, everybody. Can everybody hear? It's okay? Okay, great. So today I'll be talking a bit about going from a feature factory to a value creation organization. As Andre mentioned, I've worked in product management now for almost a decade, and most notably companies like these. So how many folks are familiar with the concept of a feature factory from John Cutler? Read the article? Okay, maybe about half. So if you haven't read the article, it's fantastic. It's definitely one of the sort of better articles of the last 5 or so years in product management. But he has a fantastic quote that he actually, a colleague of his said during just sort of talking about the current state of how they were delivering software. And it's sitting in the factory, cranking out features, and sending them down the line, which I think a lot of us can probably relate to. I know I can at many companies that I've worked at, where you feel that you're constantly just delivering and delivering and delivering without sort of that thinking about, is what we're doing valuable to the customer? And some of the main ingredients, although there's more in the article, are what I mentioned here, which is the connection from that delivery to user value. And this is probably the biggest one. It's the most notable one when you think about value delivery as a concept versus feature factory. It's that you'll keep working on features, and without any follow-up afterwards or discussion of whether that was the right thing to build, no sort of feature retro or many other practices, the KPIs or OKRs set on that. And so you lose this connection to whether or not it's a good thing to do. So that's one of the main ingredients. You start to look at success in this model, because you don't have any other metrics, is whether you make a release without any failures. So if you launch and nobody complains about it, it's like, all right, we did good, we got it out on time, fantastic. That becomes what success is. And he uses a concept of shiny objects or success theater, which is also an interesting one. There can also be much of a lack of product strategy, right? You're sort of hearing and then delivering, hearing and delivering. And you're not, as a product manager, always able to then take a step back and really dig into why are we delivering the things we're doing, and does it have real value to the customer? So these are the parts that I really want to dig in to today in the short time that we have. So before I do, the core value of product management. If you Google, what is product management, you're likely to see at least a few of the top articles focused on this concept of strategy versus execution. And so as a product manager, especially in 2018, there's more and more data sort of coming in. You have more and more tools. You've got BI, you've got Clickstream, all kinds of different tools, as well as user research. Everybody's got an opinion, and as a product manager, role is really to distill all of that and sort of come up with that main strategy, and then lead that into execution. How do you actually build that into sort of major milestones, and then project that along the way to ultimately come up with something that's compelling to your customers? So that's really the main goal and value of the role. So the most common problem that I've seen is actually in feature factories is actually this imbalance or immaturity that can happen. So what can happen is your strategy side is too small as a product manager. So what that means to me is I'll get in and I'll start to look at, okay, I'm getting told a lot what to build, and then I'm just sort of working more on the engineering side, and me and the engineers are sitting there, or me and the engineers and the designers are sort of building things. And that's a big part of the role, but that's not all of it. So the strategy in that context comes a lot from internal functional organizations. Can also, so if you're in a big company, it's probably coming from functional organizations where they're saying, hey, we have a revenue goal, or we have another target, we have this to do, just sort of go ahead and get that out the door, and by the way, can you do it in 2 months? Or can you release this next week? These types of things. But then in a startup can also be the CEO, can also be the chief revenue officer or others, where it's just sort of this, hey, ad hoc, we want to deliver this by next week because we have a demo to the CEO or these types of things. And then your product manager, or what I would feel like can often feel like a bit of a delivery girl or boy, just sort of there to sort of shuffle along with the engineers. Hey, can we do it faster? Can we, yeah, it's 2 weeks, but what if we did it in 1? What would that be like? And that can be a lot of how you feel. And so this imbalance is really, I think the root cause of it is where the data is accessible, and sort of the balance of looking at external versus internal data. So external data, I mean, this is your customer data. You're looking at customers and telling and understanding how they experience and feel your product. So for example, A/B testing. Great discussion about A/B testing, super important. It's a great way of both looking at the features that you're building as to whether they're good, but also as a product manager, and maybe not everybody feels this all the time, but as you start to A/B test over and over again with your customers, you start to understand how they respond to different changes. And understanding that helps you, again, get better in terms of just being able to work with your customers and knowing them. And then obviously the user research, there's no alternative or better alternative than just sort of going to them and being like, hey, what's your day like? How are you, using our product? What could we do to make it better? It just direct line of sight to the customer is fantastic. And the market research. What you'll see a lot of times in sort of feature factories is a large imbalance where a lot more focus is put on internal metrics. So who's familiar with the concept of a hippo? Yeah, decent amount. So it's highest paid person in the organization or highest paid person in the room. So what can happen is that hippo is sort of a giant presence that then says, hey, what about doing this? And everybody's like, yeah, okay, we'll go do that. That's what the most highest salaried person has said, so that seems like a reasonable idea. And so in the absence of other data and a strong basis and foundation and strategy, you sort of lean towards these, and this ends up skewing your product roadmap. Revenue market teams, sales, customer service, all of these, again, fantastic inputs, but when you focus only or much more heavily on these, they don't come together and sort of tell you how the customers are actually experiencing the product and want to experience it. Sales might have a target of, hey, this quarter we need to hit our goals, so we need to add this feature. But project that 3 years, now all of a sudden you have something that's making a lot of money, but you may be losing customers and dealing with a lot of churn. Or it might not be solving the core use case that it used to. Or you might have overscaled the product where your sort of engineers aren't able to then manage it. And siloed organizational objectives, which is, your marketing team will have a goal, your revenue team will have a goal, sales team have a goal. If those are the things applying the most pressure and you haven't been able to develop that product strategy, these things are going to carry your product forward, and that too heavily can drive to problematic products. So the 3 concepts, and this is, I'd say, the major thing that I'd like to make sure you take from this, is the biggest foundation is customer focus. I think you hear this a lot, and what I want to leave you with is a couple things that you can do if you're in a feature or factory to start to break this down. So if you're hearing, hey, we've got to build this, we've got to build this, we've got to build this, start as a product manager just to be a little prickly and just say, hey, why? What do you think that will drive? Can we start to follow up on the features afterwards? You can still be told to build a feature, build it, and then afterwards send out a note, hey, we looked at clickstream and turns out our transactions are actually going down. Our checkout seems to be dropping. Start to do that. Start to look at, hey, can we A/B test these couple things? And start to just, hey, FYI, stakeholders, this thing doesn't look like it's working that well. And then start to hey, what if we did this? We're starting to see this. Can we work on this feature that seems to be something that a lot of customers are asking for in customer service? By the way, it will also generate some revenue, and it's easy to build from the engineers. Start to work that in, but build that customer focus as the #1 thing as a product manager. Your goal is to be, your role is to be the voice of the customer in the room. Find every opportunity with your stakeholders. Don't be afraid if it's the CEO, whoever it is, start to weave that conversation into your discussions. Data democratization I put as the next biggest fundamental thing, because as a product manager, we live and die based on the data. And so if you have, and this can happen all the time, you're often sort of not as autonomous because you're constantly looking at, I don't have access to user research. And the market research team doesn't share the stuff with me. We don't have clickstream implemented effectively. Build that and be very vocal about that as well. And this is where, over my career, I've gotten a lot more ask everybody for data, even if it's uncomfortable. So if there's a separate analytics team, it's a workflow that goes through the CTO and then back down, and then somebody's got to sign it in blood. Get access to it, even if it takes months, because it'll be worth it in the end. Knowing about the data is incredibly important for having any sort of pull with your stakeholders. If you can start pointing out data and ways to improve based on that, that's where you can really start to build a voice. And then balancing short and long-term thinking. When we look at the public companies recently that have died because they're only looking quarter by quarter. Even if you have OKRs and they're fantastic, that's great, but make sure you have a longer-term view so that you're not only looking at how do we hit our little goal in this next 3 months, right? Where are we working towards? How are we going to start to improve this product to hit core problem areas over the next 3 years? Balance those things so that your strategy doesn't have to be rebuilt every 3 months, and that will give you a lot more sway in this as well, and that can help to break down these elements of the feature factory. So in terms of how you start to balance all of this, so use your core 4 groups, and it doesn't need to be always, if you're in a startup, sometimes not everybody has a separate user design and business team and product manager. Sometimes you, as a product manager, you might be doing a little bit of 2 or 3 of these, but this is your core 4, that you're bringing all of this data in and having these cross-functional discussions as a group, not in silos, but as a group, to then define that product vision, long-term strategy, and big hypotheses that you want to validate. So again, you want to not look at things as, hey, we're going to spend 6 months pushing this out the door, and then, hey, see you later, we're going to move on to the next thing. We're going to redesign the app. Who's been involved in a giant redesign of an app before? Yeah. Did you know whether it succeeded or not? Somebody saw whether it succeeded? Okay. Maybe half of those who raised their hands. So those types of things, and maybe you say, hey, we need a new rewrite, and then we want to iterate on top of it. That's totally fine. But when you go on these and that's your trend, you can get very, very divorced from the customer and knowing whether you're ultimately delivering value as a product manager. So all of this data, you're working with this team to really build this into. And you can add product analytics for sure into this group as a key stakeholder. And you're collaboratively working, so all of those ideas are coming in, but they're not just like, okay, this idea, then we do it. This idea, then we do it, right? It's all coming together to an actual plan that you're then executing. And this is really the key point, which is this is what you derive your product strategy into. You're bringing the stakeholders into this development. You're gathering all of this data. You're focusing it on the customer, and you're delivering value over time. So if you think back on what the core ingredients of the feature factory, connecting to the customer, primary number 1. You've got user analytics, user research, market research. You're not throwing away, hey, sales, we don't want your input. No, no, no. They're great input. But we're balancing that with everything else. We're not launching shiny objects. We're confident that the things that we're launching fit into our plan, and we're constantly iterating on that plan based on what we're learning from in-market tests and our user analytics. So that's really what I think, as a product manager, you start to push for, starting with customer focus and then building on top of that. And that's it.